thank you. Yeah. So I think I'll start from my left. We have Maristella Simiyu, who is the Africa Senior Legal Advocacy Officer at the International Press Institute. And next to her, we have Mutoki Mumo, who is the Sub-Saharan Africa representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. And next to me, we have Nadine Kampire, who is the program coordinator at Afya Amani Grand Lacs. And next to her on my far right, we have Matilda Mwenye, who is a climate journalist at the Standard Group. So this is quite a mix of legal and policy advocates, media freedom advocates, climate environmental journalists, and also disinformation experts. So I'm really excited about this conversation. And I think from the session description, some of you might have seen that one of the key things we're talking about here is not just climate-related disinformation, but also the disinformation targeted at journalists that report on climate and the environment. So there's definitely, I think, an opportunity to delve deeper into the state of climate and environmental journalism within Africa, why it is important, but also think about how we can address the disinformation relating to climate and also being targeted at the journalists that report on climate and the environment. And on that note, I'd want to kick off the conversation by asking Mary.
Okay. And when I went to the comment section, there were those who agreed with him. There are those who added, yes, when it comes to carbon credits, there are those countries who purchase from, less powerful countries, or those who are performing better and then still continue damaging the environment. And then there are those who just said, yes, I agree, and those who said, no, I don't agree. Others said he's 100% correct. And I really wished the media house had done more in the caption in terms of directing that conversation, because we need environmental reporters directing that conversation, because at the end of the day, climate and environmental issues are a very complex issue. Even when you look at the lexicon, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about biodiversity loss, when we talk about pollution, sometimes it becomes one of those things it's hard for the ordinary person to connect with. But really, we can see the tangible consequences of climate change. So for example, when you talk about climate change and link it with weather patterns, for countries that agriculture is their main income earner, you can see that produce has reduced and it's affecting farmers. If we talk about biodiversity loss and think about people who make their living from fishing, we have had that catches have reduced, so you can link the term biodiversity loss to fisheries. If you think about pollution, you can think about how there's been an increase in respiratory challenges across many African countries which are not there before. And so you can link it with our health complications. And also when I think about this, I remember a story which a Kenyan journalist told recently, that he was taking a drive with a Kenyan politician, and the Kenyan politician had a device in his car which he uses to monitor the quality of the air. And he said that when he's driving in Nairobi, he has his windows up because the air quality in Nairobi is terrible. And we are featured in the top 10 countries globally, apparently with the worst air quality. And he said, he asked his driver, whoop, round two. It makes me think about the importance of climate and environmental reporting and why we are here today. Because they are the ones who shape the narrative enough for the public to understand why issues climate change, why issues environment actually have an impact on our lives, they have an impact on our livelihoods, and it's very important to actually have the policy in place to be able to drive change in a way that we are actually protecting our futures. When you think about our land and we think about how this is impacting our future, we need climate and environmental reporters to be able to break down this conversation and the discourse and the lexicon around this and the language into narratives that can guide public discourse, that can guide public interventions, because we see great work happening in communities, as well as drive policy action. And so when we ask why it's important, at the end of the day, it's about our lives and it's about our livelihoods. I'm sure we'll discuss this even more, but let me stop there. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Mary Stella. This was just also for us to appreciate why this conversation is important. And I liked how Mary Stella linked it to the importance of climate reporting for communities that are relying, for example, on agriculture and fisheries for their livelihood, but also even, related links to issues around health. And I also appreciated the example she gave, because I think leaders, also public leaders, have a role to play in terms of influencing the climate narrative, and to see, some respected leaders that have quite a strong influence across the globe actually claiming that some of these climate conversations are a hoax and that they are fake news. It's fake news. That's actually quite concerning. But I want to hand over, and I mean, thank you for highlighting also that link and the importance to journalism, because Matilda here is a climate journalist. And I liked how you highlighted how journalists can shape the narrative and can help communities to understand some of these climate and environmental issues. So I just wanted to hear from you, Matilda, from your perspective, especially with regard to the aspect of disinformation itself. As a climate reporter, how have you seen disinformation shape climate narratives or the impact of your work in Africa, and also particularly also looking at the role of corporates and states?
Thank you very much. And just to give confidence in our shaping of narrative to Stella, that we're going to do justice to climate is hoax narrative by the Trump president. And I hope our reporting will be more in-depth and making sense of what that means to us as journalists and as a continent. And well, thanks, back to your question, climate disinformation is warped in the narrative around climate in two ways that I can think of, which I've encountered as a person. The first one is promoting myths like, for example, Africa's emission is too small to matter, or fossil fuel is equal to development. So these are narratives that are often pushed by fossil fuel lobbyists that tend to discourage investment in renewables on the continent, and also just to confuse the public. And then for the second one is how disinformation impacts us as journalists. That is, it targets us directly. I'll share with you an experience whereby I've been personally discredited online for publishing investigative stories around the dredged rivers within the Nile Basin and Kenya's carbon markets, where trolls framed me as anti-development. And reading through those trolls, I could easily see them echoing corporate talking points. Recently, we are also seeing the states weaponizing disinformation, accusing journalists of foreign agendas. So we as reporters and generally journalists, we face both distortion of climate facts and also reputational attack that is designed to silence us. So the two tend to weaken public trust in credible reporting. And then you find that the two just derail climate action and ultimately for us, press freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matilda, for sharing your personal story in terms of how you were targeted after doing an investigative report. We have seen that actually as part of the monitoring and documentation of attacks that we do at IPI, where we look at targeted attacks against reporters, and we do see some of those coordinated disinformation campaigns where there are attempts to discredit journalists because of the investigative work that they do, and especially with investigative reporting, because there are lots of interests also that will be being protected in some of those attempts, corporate interests, state interests. So thank you so much for sharing that story. And I just want to jump quickly, still on that conversation on disinformation, because Nadine Kampire here, she leads a network that does a lot of work around combating disinformation and hate speech in the Great Lakes region. So I would want to hear from you, Nadine, what strategies have worked on the ground to counter climate disinformation and protect journalists from targeted attacks. Nadine will be contributing in French, so some of you might need your interpretation devices as well. It's all right. I think Nolwenn is on standby to help us. Feel free, come through, yes. Nolwenn can help us to interpret.
Merci beaucoup, Nampilo. Merci, Nolwenn, pour la spontanéité. À cette question, il y a deux volets. Je veux partir d'abord sur les succès que nous avons atteints en combattant la désinformation. Ce que nous faisons d'abord la formation pour les journalistes et les influenceurs, bien sûr aussi les membres de la société civile, parce que ce sont ces personnes plus influentes qui font la propagation des fausses informations et des rumeurs et des mauvaises rumeurs qui sont souvent...
I'm going to translate. Okay. The response to that question is twofold. She's going to phases of their initiative. One being against combating disinformation. One being training journalists, training influencers, and training also community members who actually have a big impact on this information.
Parce que ces personnes sont le plus utilisées pour partager les fausses nouvelles et qui sont plus suivies par la population, la communauté. Nous leur formons en fact-checking, mais aussi comment vérifier les informations dans les langues locales. Parce que ce que la communauté ou le monde oublie est que les mauvaises informations sont partagées en langue locale et malheureusement, les big tech n'aident pas dans la modération des contenus en langue locale. Alors nous les faisons en langue locale pour essayer de répondre aux fake news, aux fausses rumeurs qui sont partagées dans ces langues locales.
So yes, these people, journalists, influencers, community members, are the ones that are the most used to spread misinformation, to spread fake news. So in the end, what they do is training in fact-checking, and also making sure that the training that they give are in local languages, so that people can know how to moderate information in local languages, which is not usually done by those mainstream medias.
Nous faisons aussi la diffusion de ces informations-là. Donc, s'il y a un fake news qui a été partagé, soit sur tel réseau social, soit X, WhatsApp, TikTok, nous essayons de trouver la réponse à la fausse information et partager la même réponse dans les mêmes canaux qui ont été utilisés pour propager la fausse information.
So one thing they do is making sure they identify which are the social media that have been used to spread fake news, and then debunk that information in those same social media channels.
Ce que nous faisons aussi, nous faisons des descentes dans la communauté pour essayer d'écouter la communauté, quelle est la fausse information, quelle est la rumeur qui est plus pertinente. Nous collectons ces rumeurs et nous voyons la rumeur qui est plus influente, qui est plus pertinente, et nous essayons de trouver un expert qui va essayer de donner la réponse à cette rumeur. Par exemple, en ce qui concerne la guerre dans la région, une rumeur qui parle de la participation du Rwanda pour financer le rebelle. Nous essayons de trouver quelqu'un qui est plus influent, qui peut donner une réponse adéquate, qui va apaiser les cœurs de la population. Et cette personne, après avoir donné la bonne information, nous partageons l'information qui a été partagée par cette personne pour essayer de contrer, de limiter la propagation de cette fausse rumeur.
So one thing they do is listening to local communities to make sure to identify what is the rumor that's the most spread, what is the rumor that's most influential, that's actually having the most impact in the community. And then they rely on experts on the topic that can actually address the comment, address the rumor head on. And after that, they make sure to translate it in local languages. So for instance, she was giving an example with the war in the region and how people were having concerns about the Rwandan participation. And so they made sure to find an expert who can have the legitimacy to bring some more information and reliable information on the topic.
Le deuxième volet de cette question concerne la protection des journalistes qui couvre les questions environnementales. Ce que nous faisons d'abord, nous leur montrons comment garantir leur protection personnelle, surtout en ligne, parce que, comme l'a dit Mathilda, beaucoup de journalistes font face au harcèlement et aux attaques en ligne. Alors, nous leur formons sur la sécurité numérique, comment se protéger en ligne et comment ne pas céder à la pression en ligne.
And the second aspect of what they do is protecting journalists covering environmental issues. Like you said, they try to make sure that they are trained on cyber security, online security, and to know how to protect themselves online and not to let themselves be affected by discourse around their work.
Mais aussi, nous fournissons le soutien légal aux journalistes qui font face aux attaques de la part des autorités ou aux censures, qui ont besoin d'un soutien légal et qui n'ont pas assez de moyens. Nous collaborons avec différentes organisations, entre autres, il y a Media Defense qui aide à fournir un soutien légal, et les journalistes n'auront pas besoin de payer quoi que ce soit, mais sera assisté gratuitement, légalement.
And they also provide legal support for journalists targeted by authorities to make sure that those that don't have the means to defend themselves are able to do so. And I think Media Defense is one of their partners on that issue.
Mais aussi, nous reportons sur les menaces. Donc, s'il y a un journaliste qui subit les attaques ou les menaces de la part des autorités, nous essayons de documenter ces cas-là que nous référençons à différents partenaires parce que nous n'avons pas assez de moyens pour leur fournir la relocalisation ou d'autres soutiens. Alors, je crois que IP, dans ces cadres, est en train de nous aider. Le dernier cas que nous avons eu a été référencé à IP et je crois qu'ils sont dans les démarches pour aider la personne à quitter la ville parce que sa famille et elle est menacée.
And support to those journalists can also be in the form of collaboration with IPI. When those reporters are under threat, where their families are threatened, making sure they can relocate on to other safer areas.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and thank you to our honorary speaker, Nolwe. We appreciate you for the interpretation there. And I mean, Nadine raised quite important points, and I was just going through. If you see me on my phone, I'm not on TikTok or anything, I'm taking notes. But she raised something quite interesting, and coincidentally something that I actually also read this morning around training of influencers, because someone did a post on LinkedIn this morning and they were saying influencers have now become conduits of news and information and trusted sources of news and information, and the unfortunate part is that some of them are paid also for some of the content that they push. So how can we redefine journalism in such an environment? And so I appreciate, you know, Nadine's contribution and highlight where she highlighted that they're also training influencers to address issues of disinformation, which I think is important, and also an important acknowledgement of the role that influencers are playing in the information ecosystem. So thank you for raising that. And also, like she rightly said, that IPI, some of the work we are doing actually is also coordinating support to journalists in distress, especially with partners like CPJ that do have you know, the necessary resources to be able to provide support to journalists in distress. And on that note, I want to hand over to Mutoki. You know, CPJ does a lot of reporting on attacks against journalists. And I think from Mutoki, I'm curious to hear, in terms of your work, how are climate journalists in Africa being specifically targeted, and what are the trends that you are seeing as part of your work?
I'm going to begin by not answering your question. Yes, or perhaps more precisely plagiarizing UNESCO. It's difficult to have a full comprehensive picture of what journalists covering the environment and the climate crisis are facing, because it's a research gap. I think we must all acknowledge that. But UNESCO last year came out with a report that I think we should remind ourselves of, where they looked at data over 15 years and they found that at least 749, if I'm not mistaken, journalists covering the environment, climate, had faced some form of attack. Some of them had been killed, many with impunity. And they further did a survey of journalists from, I think, over 100 countries who cover the environment, and they asked them about the safety issues they faced. And what they found was that a significant percentage, over half of those journalists, reported facing some sort of pressure, aggression, threats, attacks in connection to their work. So the reason I'm highlighting this is I think it's, and someone can correct me, but one of the few pieces of data that we have of a big picture, a global picture. What we tend to see at CPJ and what we report are more individualized stories. And we can say that what UNESCO is reporting at a global level is reflected and echoed in these stories of individual journalists. If we look at the African continent, at the African region, I was just going back through the recent reports that we've had, and we could see that journalists covering particularly mining and the kind of impact that mining has on local communities have faced aggression, including in Ghana. Just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, we published a story about, or a statement about Congolese journalists in hiding for 2 months because of threats associated to their reporting of mining activities. And these are just snippets, snippets of what is going on across this region, often uncovered, of journalists who are trying to be on the front lines. If we look at East Africa, for instance, if anyone who's been following the environmental news in that region is aware of what's happening in Ngorongoro in Tanzania, And we've also heard of journalists attempting to cover that, the impact of moving the indigenous communities to make way, ironically, for conservation. Journalists reporting that have faced threats. So there's this big global picture, and we have snippets, anecdotes that tell us that all is not well for journalists covering the environment, covering the climate crisis in Africa, but a very big awareness that there's a big research gap that we as an organization also hope to fill, to truly understand the kind of specific and unique challenges that they face.
Thank you very much, Muthoki, especially for individualizing your contribution and highlighting some of these cases and attacks that we are seeing against climate environmental journalists. I remember I was in Tanzania in 2022 for the Africa Media Convention. I think that was the first one, and we did go to Ngorongoro. I mean, it's a beautiful place. But I remember even at that time, some people were saying, if we are true human rights practitioners, we should not be going on this Ngorongoro escapade because of what they are doing to the indigenous communities there in Ngorongoro and also to the journalists that are reporting. But I think the love of things in us also took over. But truly, there are scenarios that we are seeing. Nadine also spoke about, things happening even in the context of war. She's also, from DRC, where there are also lots of reporting around the mining sector itself. So we are seeing lots of cases around that. Illegal mining in Ghana, definitely we have so many cases that we have been seeing also in those countries. So indeed, there are attacks that are happening against journalists that are reporting, on these things, and I do agree that we need to report more and document more about some of these attacks. At IPI, we did a report, I think last year, but it was also a global report, Climate Journalism Under Fire. It was also a global report, but it did also have these individualized stories from Nigeria, from Cameroon, Ghana, and other countries, also looking at stories of environmental journalists and what they went through as they were reporting on some of the investigative pieces. But obviously, some of these stories were now, especially these attacks, they were now being reported after the fact, and we have not seen much reporting actually as the journalists are undertaking their work. It's always reflective pieces, of the experiences that the journalists go through as they are investigating environmental related stories. But on that same note as well, I think I'd want to come back between the two of you, Muthoki and Mary Stella, especially around online disinformation campaigns. And just to get a sense of, whether you have seen such cases or perhaps it's something that you have thought about, how online disinformation campaigns also translate to physical threats against journalists and what protective measures are most urgently needed. Perhaps we can start with you, Mary Stella, and then Muthoki can jump in after.
I would want to respond to it, but just listening to Matilda's experience, I wonder whether she can actually bet, with your permission, moderator, whether she can actually share, because then there's a personalized experience there, because we see how the different information ecosystems, offline and online, are connected. And yeah.
Perhaps Muthoki, you want to jump in before?
Yeah, sure. I'll just make a very quick submission. That's, again, rather big picture here. And I want to acknowledge that what I'm talking about is not restricted to journalists covering the environment. It's more of a generalistic comment. 2 years ago, we at CPJ were part of a project run by the University of British Columbia that was researching reputational attacks on journalists. I think this is what Matilda was talking about earlier. And it was a survey across 67 countries asking journalists about their experiences with reputational attacks. Now, we've been using this phrase quite a bit. I think the quick definition of it is, public statements that are meant to undermine the credibility of a journalist and their work, and in that way silence them. And what was found is that there was a correlation, I don't want to call it necessarily a causation, between the people who were receiving reputational attacks, mostly online, and the people receiving in real IRL, in real life type of attacks. So people who were reporting that they were facing misinformation campaigns or harassment online were also more likely to say they're facing legal threats or they're facing intimidation physically, or that they're facing arrest and violence. So there's a correlation there. And if we individualize it again, in the research that we do, and the case that comes to mind for me especially is Ethiopia, where we've seen time and time again these campaigns that are carried out against individual journalists by, I don't know, inauthentic accounts, I suppose, preceding or happening around the same time that you have in an offline attack. So someone gets some sort of campaign against them, and then a couple of days later, they're arrested. And you have, I don't want, it's not causation for me, it feels almost, and I'm not sure if I'm using this properly, like manufacturing consent for what you're going to do offline. So there is a correlation there, and it's been seen in big data sets, but it's also been seen in individual cases that we've reported. But I think it's very important for us to emphasize that harm that happens in the digital space is harm at the end of the day. It's not less harmful just because someone didn't also come to your house and try to break down your door as they were harassing you online. Because at the end of the day, the impact can be equally insidious. It can push people off those offline spaces. It can push journalists not to engage with their audiences, not to use these spaces to do research. It can have dire psychological harm, traumatic effects. And in that way, even if it doesn't correlate and translate to, you know, what we consider the real world, it can be equally as insidious in silencing individual journalists or media houses.
Thank you, Mutoki. I think, you know, just as I was taking notes, I find it really powerful what you say, that, you know, an online attack is equally as harmful and as dangerous as an offline attack. I think Targeted Rights Initiative is here, and they have an exhibition somewhere outside where they've also been doing a campaign on online attacks, on technology-facilitated violence. And those are some of the things that they've been saying, actually, that some conduct is not excusable simply because it's an online attack. And I think it's important, even when we think about digital rights, you know, that conversation of whether digital rights are human rights, because I think those are some of the conversations that are made to downplay the impact of online attacks. So thank you for highlighting that, and also that aspect of how, you know, some of these online or reputational attacks are a way of trying to justify ensuing physical attack. That at the time when a person is arrested, people are like, yeah, you know, it's justified because they've already been a preceding coordinated campaign or attack online against them. And actually, you reminded me of a story of Stanis Bujakera. Sometime last year, we did 3 case studies on coordinated disinformation campaigns in Africa. So Stanis Bujakera's case, Stanis Bujakera from DRC, was one of the cases we looked at. And then also attacks against John Allan Namu and African Censored in Kenya. That was around the time, I think, they'd done some reporting on a fertilizer scam or something of that sort. And also, I can't remember the third one. I think it was from Ghana. I think attacks against Sinozo and some an investigative journalist from Ghana. But you see all these things happening that, you know, there's always this coordinated disinformation campaign, and then there are related cases of arrest and detention, or related cases of legal cases being filed against the targeted journalists. And Matilda, I'm happy to also hear from you how you've also been seeing some of these interlinkages between online attacks or disinformation campaigns and physical threats.
Thank you. Sometimes it's very difficult to talk about how I experience this. If I was reporting, I would really report what you're saying very well, rather than talking and, you know, just explaining. And these threats are real. And I came from investigative and crime background. And when I told my editors that this time round I would like to do climate and environment because I felt it was a soft beat, oh my goodness. I'm just in the crime scene, like every day. So I just can't retreat, but the best thing that the background really helps me to have a deep dive into these things. And of course, the disinformation attacks come in all ways. If you want to hear my experience, so many times the state have threatened to sue me, but they have never sued me. I don't know why. but perhaps it's also just a strategy to make you feel, you know, like you are discredited, like what you're doing doesn't really matter. I've been physically followed, gotten into people's houses, and the next day when I get to my house, I find a note, "We found you." And then I've also had to go in hiding several times, and the trolls never end. And sometimes I retreat from online space because, you know, you are the target. And we are very few climate journalists in Kenya. We're just a paltry because of the kind of hostile environment we work in. So these are real stories. And yes, some of us have been physically brutalized, like beaten physically, because of the issues around conservancies, you know, carbon markets. So, and we rely mainly, unfortunately, on just peer alliances to find refuge, or fact-checking, you know, network, or just global solidarity rather than our legal systems. Because as cyber laws in the countries where, like for instance in Kenya, are more designed to protect the state rather than the truth.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for putting you on the spot and asking you to recount some of those, you know, gruesome experiences. And I appreciate you doing that also, because I think it's important to realize that there are real people behind some of these online attacks that are impacted and silenced by some of these online attacks. And I think on that same note as well, I would want perhaps to come to Nadine, just thinking about how African journalists can collaborate to resist disinformation attacks. I know that Afya Amani is a network, so there's lots of collaboration that is happening there. How can we promote more collaboration? What avenues for collaboration are there? I understand that interpretation is not working, so feel free to also use the devices.
Ok. Je peux y aller? Ok, merci. D'accord. Je crois que pour mieux travailler et essayer à combattre la désinformation au niveau africain et régional, il serait plus important de créer un réseau de journalistes, un réseau africain ou régional pour lutter contre la désinformation. Il faudra aussi avoir un même modèle de base de données qui va permettre aux journalistes de documenter rapidement les fausses informations. Donc, une base de données qui va permettre que les fausses informations soient mises et soient rapidement traitées pour essayer de combattre, de donner une réponse rapide pour éviter différents dégâts. Je crois aussi qu'il faut faire plus de formation et des jumelages entre différents médias de la région ou de l'Afrique pour essayer d'échanger les expériences et ce qui marche chez nous, ce qui ne marche pas ailleurs, et essayer de tous évoluer au même pied d'angle. Je sais qu'il y a beaucoup déjà des réseaux de fact-checking en Afrique, mais il faut en multiplier, il faut le multiplier plus. À part les formations, je crois qu'il faut plus mettre la pression sur les géants technologiques, donc les tenanciers de plateformes, entre autres Facebook, X, Twitter, TikTok, pour essayer de favoriser la modération des contenus en langue locale, qui est plus capitale pour lutter contre la désinformation en Afrique. Il faudra aussi protéger les journalistes, donc d'abord l'autoprotection et puis la protection entre journalistes, mais aussi leur montrer comment lutter contre le harcèlement en ligne, la surveillance et les assister en cas d'arrestation et de censure. Voilà ce que je peux dire pour essayer d'améliorer et de contribuer à la lutte contre la désinformation en Afrique.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for sharing that some of the work that you are doing as part of Afya Amani. I think on that same conversation of what needs to be done, I would want to hear, I'll come back to you, Mary Stella, you dodged the other question. But perhaps back to you, what skills or tools do you think journalists need to resist, especially climate and environmental journalists, what tools do they need to resist some of these disinformation campaigns, whether it's targeted at them personally or it's disinformation related to climate?
Thank you very much, Nompilo. So I'm going to speak about a tool that IPI actually, I believe, released last year, and it's called the Guide to Decoding Disinformation. So this guide is actually free. You can find it online on our website, and it can be used not only by journalists, but also fact checkers, researchers can make use of it. And basically, it's this step-by-step guide as to how you can research disinformation, especially targeted disinformation and smear campaigns against journalists. So for example, the first step, it's a compact guide, so very easy to read. I think it's 11 pages or so it shouldn't take you a long time, and the structure is quite good. So when it comes to the steps, for example, it starts by let's analyze the context, because we know different contexts. You have to first start and understand the context. So it could be certain events that have happened that are driving this disinformation campaign. We know during elections, for example, when protests are happening, our information ecosystems are a bit more vulnerable. And media and journalists can be more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns during this space. So it could be that event that is happening. It could just be the nature of politics or the social environment in a country that makes journalists more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns. So the first step is really understanding that context. Then the second step is looking towards analyzing the timeline, the platforms, and disinformation methods. So if it's the timeline, when did it start and how has it progressed? Which stage are we at? If it's the platforms, what platforms are they using? Are they using, is it YouTube? Is it X or Twitter? Is it Facebook? Is it WhatsApp? So what platforms are being used to disseminate these disinformation campaigns? And three, what are the dissemination methods? So it could be, for example, are they using deepfakes to drive certain disinformation campaigns? Are they using certain hashtags? Are they using certain memes? So the second step is just analyzing those timeline platforms and methods being used. The third step is looking at the actors involved. I believe it's Nadine who has mentioned sometimes that it could be social media influencers who are being used, it could be politicians, but even bringing something else that has been rising is podcasters, because we see the growth of podcasting in the African continent. I know in South Africa there's a very famous one, but I like it so much in terms of analyzing politics. I think it's called SMWX, but beyond, that's a good one, but you can see somebody's looking at me weird from South Africa. But then if you look at other podcasters, there are people who you get the microphone, and in terms of fact-checking, in terms of them being used as a tool for targeting media houses, it's something that we have seen in a number of African countries. So it could be also the podcasters, it could be social media influencers, or it could even be fringe media houses that are being used to drive these disinformation campaigns. So here is identifying the actors involved, and even going beyond that and seeing who could be the sponsor. I remember in Kenya during the last elections, there was a good research that was done there where social media influencers actually being paid by politicians from both government and opposition to drive certain disinformation campaigns, and such research is very good in terms of just finding out who are the actors involved. And then the final step will be towards pinpointing the narratives, what narratives are being used in this disinformation campaign. And that can require great research in terms of fact-checking, analyzing the content that you've seen, and it will also require the media houses, the journalists also reach out to other people, make use of your networks in terms of researchers, people who work in, data scientists, and people in academia and people in NGO to be able to actually analyze this content. And I know we have actually built good networks in this space. And really at the end of the day is to discover, what is the purpose of this campaign when you're investigating such a story, and come up with a report that will guide further intervention. So here it's fact-based, advocacy fact-based intervention. And at the end of the day, the journalist is able to answer these are the 5 W's and 1 H. Why is this being done? Who is doing it? What are they doing? Where are they doing this? When are they doing this? And how are they doing this? So this tool also appreciates the fact that there are also other organizations that have developed immensely useful tools for journalists. And if you go to the guidebook, you will see links to other resources that have been developed that can also guide you in terms of how to undertake some of this investigation, who to reach out to when you're done with the investigation. So I do implore you all to go to our website and interact with this resource as well as the other resources mentioned therein. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maristella. Maristella is a doctor of law, so I'm surprised she gave a brief about the guide in a few minutes like that. I really appreciate. I was looking at you and I was saying, I hope she doesn't lecture us. So thank you so much for taking such a short time just to give a brief about that guide. And also highlighting that, it gives reference to other existing tools. And I know Matilda has been working with Magamba Network. There's a Fake News Fighters Initiative, which is also looking at climate disinformation. You've been working with Magamba Network, and I think you've also developed some toolkits. Maybe you can just also give us a brief about the initiative, about the toolkit, and also how it works, and maybe how it can also benefit the different actors that are also trying to look around, Africa climate disinformation.
Well, as I mentioned, we rely on peer networks. So I looked around just to find which network can actually help me, fight disinformation. And of course, I've been attending a number of COPs, and we see a lot of greenwashing where corporates invest, like fossil fuel companies, invest millions in PR that just undermine science and also directly attacking us. So we sat down and we looked at what tools really do exist that can help us, identify and just even debunk falsehood. And so we came up with the very first African climate disinformation toolkit. And Magamba Network, the also thing that really made me want to work with them, leads in creative climate works. They use a lot of satire, hip hop, soccer to communicate climate stories, making sure that they are relatable to wider audience. So mostly they focus on building information integrity, spotting and identifying polluters, and also just empowering young people. So the Fake News Fighters Initiative, which really made me want to work with them, is that they equip journalists like me, young people, and even creators with tools to counter falsehood. So with the support of UNESCO, they combine media monitoring training and storytelling with the toolkit as a center output. And then we have these Africa Climate Hubs, which is also a very interesting hub to work with because it links hubs in the Southern Africa, East and West Africa, where they bring youth voices and indigenous knowledge together. By doing so, they showcase how our traditional ecological practices strengthens resilience. And most importantly, we have seen that these hubs, they tend to help us fight disinformation, not just within the newsroom, but we have to understand that we really need networks that can help us develop skills of both, countering disinformation, a mix of digital resilience, scientific literacy, and this toolkit really gives us those tools to equip ourselves with these skills.
Thank you very much, Matilda, especially, that aspect around creative storytelling. I think one of the exhibitions out there is also around storytelling. For us as especially, NGOs, you'd find that our work is standard and very predictable. Our advocacy statements are very predictable. So I find it really interesting to seeing, other institutions thinking about creative ways of advocacy, and doing these poetry slams and all these fun things. I see Hagen is here. I know that DWA used to do some rap battles and stuff around that relating to media and information literacy. So yeah, I really appreciate also, some of these cool interventions that are also being used to push our advocacy work, and especially with Magamba around climate disinformation in Africa. Thank you for sharing that. And Maristella, when you mentioned podcasters, I recently did a piece on legal and ethical dilemmas of podcasting because of the open chat podcast in South Africa. I know they're currently being investigated by the South Africa Human Rights Commission. So yeah, you'd find that as the media landscape is evolving, there are all these various issues that are coming out, but disinformation is one of them. And I think it's important to start thinking about how we can ensure that new media is also empowered, and we build the capacity of new media platforms to also resist disinformation and promote information integrity. And I think because I want to give also an opportunity for the rest of, everyone who's here to contribute to this conversation, I just want to quickly wrap up with the panelists. Perhaps just a few more questions, perhaps just one more question. So many countries are developing disinformation laws. Mutoki introduced me to a colleague who is in Angola, who's from Angola. So I wanted to contribute at some point because I think Angola also has some disinformation law in the pipeline. But we have also been seeing countries thinking about disinformation and actually criminalizing disinformation. So I'm interested, from all the panelists, but also targeting our legal advocacy officer and Mutoki, just to get a sense of what are your thoughts around disinformation laws? Because indeed, especially from this conversation, we are agreeing that there is climate disinformation, and there's also even disinformation being targeted against journalists. So disinformation is truly a challenge. And states are coming with the solution, disinformation laws. So what's your perspective around disinformation laws, especially as they relate to free expression? I'll start with you, Mtoki.
I want to quote Matilda in my beginning. She said earlier that cyber laws are, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing, not a direct quote, created to protect the state, not to protect the journalist or the people. Yes? This is roughly what you said. And actually, thank you for asking this, because I was sparing this for, that comment when they tell you your last comment. This was supposed to be my last comment. And I think we should all really be engaging and trying as much as possible to learn and be involved in the policy making and legislative processes that are happening, particularly around cybercrime laws. Because we've seen time and time again that they're pronounced as, the solution to these numerous online harms that politicians will expound on at length. In Kenya, when we passed our cybercrime law, they said, people were leaking the nudes of politicians, and therefore we need a new law. And when you look at those laws and the way they're written, they're not, as Matilda said, meant to protect our speech or to protect the people from cyber harms. They're actually meant to protect large parts of them, the state, from criticism, and to expand powers that have been restricted in other ways. I'll use Zambia as an example. Zambia earlier this year passed a Cybercrimes Act, and also a Cybersecurity Act. And when you look at the Cybercrimes Act, it introduces things that we're all familiar with, criminalization of speech under the guise of fighting disinformation and misinformation. But then if you look at the Cybersecurity Act, massively expands the state's surveillance capacity, massively expands the the circumstances under which law enforcement and other state actors can carry out warrantless searches and seizures. And it's a pattern. My colleague is there. She might be able to contribute on Angola. And I know in many of our countries, the legislature rubber stamps, but I feel like there's room for us as people who are existing in a digitalized world to engage, to learn, and to challenge. Because these laws are being passed, and maybe the first person who will be targeted is a blogger. But as we've seen in some of our countries, I'm thinking Uganda, for instance, they'll come for teenagers on TikTok, and they'll come for you with your opinion. Or if you decide to start a podcast to comment on, I don't know, shoes, and you happen to say that the Chief Justice has ugly shoes, they'll come for you. So I think there's really room to engage in those processes at the very basic to inform ourselves. And I think some of us can agree, sometimes it feels like you're screaming to yourself, to inform ourselves and to understand that, yes, disinformation is a problem, misinformation is a problem. It's probably going to be exacerbated by the widespread use of AI. But is this law that is being proposed really the cure? And most times it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nompilo. And I will direct you to another resource. It's not updated, but it's a good place to start. It's called Lexota. It stands for Laws on Expression Online. Lexota, Laws on Expression Online something. I don't know how I forgot. I actually worked on it. But what it does is a good starting point in the sense that it coalesces the different laws that we are seeing being developed in the African countries that touch on false news and does an analysis to what extent they actually comply with international laws and standards. And what we found in this assessment, and this was done by the Center for Human Rights, Article 19, West Africa was involved, Paradigm, CIPESA, our host also were involved. And what we found really is when you look at these laws, one, they are vague, and I think to some extent they could be deliberately vague, and that vagueness is often weaponized against critical voices. Two, as Nompilo mentioned, you have criminal sanctions, so they are disproportionate. They are disproportionate when you look at the sanctions, and these are actually not necessary. And three, yes, they do pretend to be, pursuing a legitimate aim, but often they don't meet that three-part test of limitations of rights at international law, because we do agree when we talk about false news, we're also thinking about the right to freedom of expression, and we also contend that it's not an unlimited right, but if it has to be limited, it has to comply with that three-part test of limitations of rights at international law. So I will direct you to Lexota just to look at the laws that are being developed and the impact that they are having on free expression and media freedom in the African continent. And so strategic litigation has been a good place to fight some of these laws in a number of our countries. We've been going to the courts to challenge some of these provisions, especially to the extent that they do not meet that three-part test of limitations of rights. We did that in Kenya for the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act that Mudhoki has mentioned. Unfortunately, I was very disappointed by the judgment at the High Court level, because I don't think the judge understood what was the main issue here, because he did make reference to Kenya's history when it comes to the spread of hate speech, especially during elections. He made reference to the fact that especially in 2007 we had the worst kind of post-election violence, and it was driven by such incendiary speech online. And he felt that the act in itself was a good shield against that, but when he didn't analyze and didn't pay attention to the development of soft law guidelines around this issue of false news, because even if you look at the African continent, the Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, it calls on states to repeal false news laws that have criminal sanctions, because criminal sanctions have been used to target critical voices, as Matilda mentioned, to protect the state, to stifle our expression and ensure that we do not push for accountability for some of the harms that we are seeing in that regard. So it's important that if we are going to use the law as a way of addressing false news, it has to be in a way that aligns with international laws and standards. And at this point, they make us seem like the law is not even a good shield, and for a lawyer to say that it might be sacrilegious, but then I'm just thinking how the law has been weaponized in the African continent has not been to the good of free expression. So I do do encourage continued activism. The judgment, it has been on appeal, I think since 2020, and we are expecting a judgment, an appeal judgment in 2026, next year in February, and we are hoping the appeal court, because we've had some good judgments from the Court of Appeal, that it will actually be more leaning towards protecting freedom of expression, and as opposed to using the law as a weapon against expression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure how we are doing on time since we started late. I've been looking for cues on whether we're supposed to end at a particular time or not, but I'm yet to get any cue. So on that note, maybe let's just shift quickly to Nadine and Matilda, while Mutoki thinks of another closing statement, because she has already used the one she was supposed to use. But yeah, I think as we just wrap up, I'm just thinking about solutions, recommendations. And these would be recommendations to states and recommendations to corporates, because I think these are the institutions or actors that have been at the forefront of most of the attacks and the coordinated disinformation campaigns that we've been seeing, especially against climate and environmental journalists. So Matilda, we'll start with you. Just in a few words, what would be your recommendations to either of the two or maybe even to both actors?
Thank you very much. And actually, if I have to state a little bit about the cyber laws, from journalistic experience, is a double trap for us. While they claim to, fight disinformation in real sense, they criminalize dissent. So for us journalists, when disinformation is targeted to us, relying on this law becomes unsafe. Filing complaints can backfire, whereby it exposes us to more state scrutiny. And that is what has been happening to us. So just in recommendation, the state must guarantee press freedom. That is by, coming up with reforming cyber laws to target well-coordinated manipulation campaigns online rather than targeting independent journalists. They must also invest in public information. By so doing, they reduce the vacuum in which disinformation thrives. And for corporates, they must stop greenwashing. And because why do they have to invest a lot of money in PR just to undermine science and attack us? So the corporates must also be compelled to disclose their lobbying and advertising. And so both the state and companies, they should really support independent fact-checking platforms, and this also support, to protect journalists from online attacks. And these can be, coming up with programs help us access rapid response, legal aid, and even digital security trainings. By so doing, we neutralize attacks before they escalate.
Merci beaucoup. Mathilda a tout dit. Ce que je vais ajouter, je dirais que les États doivent agir en protecteur, pas en personne qui essaie d'attaquer les journalistes en favorisant la désinformation. Ils doivent établir de lois et mécanismes de protection des journalistes qui œuvrent dans le secteur de l'environnement, mais aussi contrer les entreprises d'extraction des minéraux pour leur demander de donner accès aux données, surtout aux journalistes et d'investigation, pour qu'il n'y ait pas assez de désinformation. Parce qu'on a essayé dernièrement de faire une formation avec les journalistes du Rwanda qui se sont plaints qu'un journaliste qui va sur un site minier n'a pas souvent accès au site et souvent est soit tabassé. Il y a ceux qui ont été tabassés par la communauté environnante ou les personnes qui exploitent illégalement les sites miniers, mais aussi les entreprises ne donnent pas accès aux données et ne les aident pas à trouver autant de données sur l'environnement et surtout. Et cela favorise la désinformation. L'État doit contrer ces entreprises à fournir autant d'informations que veulent les journalistes. Cela va favoriser la lutte contre la désinformation, mais aussi garantir la protection des journalistes en élaborant des lois qui les protègent. Voilà, merci.
Thank you very much. I think that component on access to data is quite important. I know that there is already an ongoing consultation being coordinated by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in collaboration with several partners. I think one of them is Alt Advisory or Research ICT Africa, I can't remember either of those, actually on developing a resolution on access to data, because I think it's also important to provide access to data for environmental journalists, which subsequently would also address some of the information gaps where disinformation thrives. Over to you, Mtoki.
Am I supposed to? Can I suggest we get questions?
Okay, cool.
Yes. I don't have to come up with another closing remark. If you guys ask questions instead, we can do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm seeing there are lots of questions, which is great. Thank you so much. I didn't want to not give my speakers the last chance to speak, but I'm happy that they were also considerate of the rest of the participants in the session. So perhaps let's hear.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists, for your engagement. And Matilda, I feel you, and I come from Kenya. I've been a journalist way back, but I'm still in the space, and we continue training journalists and under interviews, especially through the environmental reporting, and disinformation is quite a huge challenge. I've had so much conversation in terms of equipping journalists to, counter this misinformation when it comes to climate change. But I'm also wondering, where does the community come in? Because we keep saying that we need to empower the communities to be able to know what is, fake, but also to be able to be equipped themselves to be able to be resilient when it comes to misinformation. So I'm wondering if there's any case studies or work that you've done in DRC when it comes to, equipping the community to be able to be resilient when it comes to climate misinformation. Let me just.
Thank you very much. I was looking out for Hagen because I know they do media and information literacy work, and I was hoping they can also talk about some of their interventions, but perhaps Nadine, you can respond to this, and then we...
Ok, merci beaucoup. En ce qui concerne la formation de la communauté, c'est que nous faisions dans les temps, quand nous avions encore le moyen de collaborer avec les radios. Nous fournissions quelques leçons de lutte contre la désinformation, donc la vérification, comment vérifier le fait. Et on partageait par semaine 2 ou 3 leçons de vérification de faits à la communauté. Comment ne pas partager les fausses informations, comment vérifier si l'information, éviter de partager directement dans les groupes avant de vérifier si l'information que tu as reçue est vraie ou fausse, mais aussi comment fact-checker les images qui sont partagées avec les outils les plus simples à utiliser, entre autres Tiny A, images renversées. Et ce sont les petites notions de base qu'on essaye de partager avec la communauté pour leur permettre aussi à leur tour de lutter contre la désinformation.
I'll stand. Thank you, panelists.